If you want to gauge success as a teacher using poses, or at least gauge how much your message is getting through in terms of alignment and how much awareness people are cultivating, which is part of yoga, is to see if their downward dogs get better.
Hi, I'm Jane.
I'm
And this is
Sarah.
Sarah, and we're yoga posers. And today we're talking about downward facing dog.
The most famous yoga pose ever. You're bound to see it in almost any yoga class.
Adho Mukha Svanasana.
Svanasana?
SV.
I don't know. It's
Svanasana.
really tricky, the Sanskrit on that one. So I usually never say the Sanskrit for that.
I never do. I
Yeah.
mumble it.
But no, you can really trust our expertise.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
we've been teaching yoga for decades and practicing for a combined 70 years. And we're
almost
yoga
a century.
therapists. Almost three quarters of a
Almost
century.
3/4.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
We've been practicing for a long, long time. But
And this is a pose that evolves over time, and you will have a very interesting relationship with it. It's one of the most fundamental poses, and it's like a family member almost. And so you're like, here this pose is again.
yeah. You're reminding me that there's so many poses, and downward dog is one of them, that when I first started doing them, it didn't feel magic in my body. It felt more like suffering a little bit
Yeah.
because it's supposed to be a rest pose and I can get that energy from it, but it was really hard on my wrists. And that's the number one complaint is the wrists. It was just awkward feeling. And I remember people talking about being a rest pose, and I couldn't conceive how it would feel like a rest pose in my body. And it does now after a long time of practicing. But do you have a personal story?
My first experience of doing downward facing dog was feeling slightly dizzy after I did it.
That's
because-
another one of the complaints.
Yeah, because I have very low blood pressure. And so I'd put my head upside down, and when I'd come out, I would be sort of very mildly woozy.
Do you like that feeling?
No.
Because I do on occasion. I get that feeling on occasion and I enjoy it.
Well, it's interesting what we seek out in terms of sensation. And when something is a resting pose, does that mean there's the absence of sensation? It just means that it feels
no.
restful. And in some ways, I think what's nice about downward dog is it helps you assess where you are within the practice itself. So within that particular class or sequence that you're doing, every time you do downward facing dog, it's going to feel a little different. And
Yeah.
hopefully it keeps feeling better and better as the class goes on.
It's almost like a punctuation point in a sense.
That grammar.
Yeah. All right. We touched upon two of the most common complaints is that it's really difficult on the wrists and people can get dizzy. There can be that issue with blood pressure. And then there's also just the frustration with getting the legs straight. And that's a fun thing for me because when I started with yoga, I always want my legs straight, and I can have my legs straight right now, but I never choose to. I prefer not to. And then the shoulders get really congested and gunky, and it can be really uncomfortable in your shoulders and your arms and your neck. Even I've seen people with their neck, either they're looking up or they're letting it hang down.
Too low. And it's hard to know what you're doing in the pose. And that's where having your practice in front of teachers becomes really important, or practicing at home with a mirror so that you can understand what's happening. And all of these problems, I think, are related. The tight, short hamstrings or overly long hamstrings, whether or not you're hinging at the hip properly, all of that affects how you're placing weight on your arms. And the more ambitiously you try to straighten your legs, the more unsuccessfully you might be hinging at the hip, therefore placing too much weight on the arms. So you get congestion at the shoulders, compression in the wrists.
Okay, so that's very cool. So let's take it through what downward facing dog looks like, but let's talk about it. It's a 90-degree angle theoretically between the thigh and the chest, a hinge at the hips, and the hands and the feet are the base of the pose that's in connection with the earth. And the distribution of the weight between the hands and the feet is, I've read somewhere where they say 50-50, but you and I were talking about it. Get more of it off your hands. You want more of it in the lower half of your body, which is stronger.
Especially early in the practice when the wrists are probably more sensitive and we want to get the legs warmed up for standing poses. You want to be bending those knees early, squatting a bit in the pose to get the muscles of the legs working. They're reluctant to work. And so you want to start there.
I love to take these poses and do them either on the floor or seated or whatever. Just find that shape. And so thinking of downward dog as this kind of 90-degree angle, it's like staff pose. It's a seated pose where your pelvis is neutral, your legs are extended, and your torso straight. So if you're someone for whom sitting straight up and feeling your sit bones and having your legs extended on the ground is really difficult, then down dog is not going to be available to you in that image,
Right.
if that
Straight
makes
legs
sense.
are right. It's a nice way to assess, can you actually hinge at the hip? So if you're sitting in Dandasana, your legs are straight out in front of you and your ankles are flexed. So the
Yes.
toes are pulling back towards the knees. Are you sitting on your tailbone? Are you sitting on your gluteals, your buttocks?
Yeah.
If so, you have to bend your knees, untuck your sit bones, which is a really common sitting cue that teachers give with good reason, so that you properly hinge at the hip so the lumbar spine is not rounding backwards. We want to remove some of that ability for the spine to round way too easily when the legs are forced to be straight.
Right.
So
Right.
go ahead and bend those knees, push your hands down into the floor to elongate the spine.
Right.
That's a nice way to gently coax or warm up or build the awareness for downward facing dog.
Right. And I think most poses, we're trying to find that sense of uplift and length in the spine when you're trying to extend your leg straight and you can't do it. So you get a posterior tilt in the pelvis because something's got to give. Then you're not really able to get the extension and length in the spine because your front body, your core is going to be shortened.
Right. And so thinking of this pose and many other forward folds in yoga, of which downward dog is a forward fold, you're lengthening the back body. And so when the hamstrings are short, it's easier for the relatively weaker back muscles to lengthen than it is for the hamstrings to lengthen. And so yoga becomes a lot about the hamstrings because there are so many forward folds. And downward dog is that encounter, so that the strongest sensation in the pose for many people is the sensation of their short, tight hamstrings. And the hamstrings affect that pelvic tilt because of where they attach. So for teachers and students, it's really helpful to know that your hamstrings, a series of 3 muscles at the back of the thigh, they attach to your sit bones at the bottom of the pelvis, and then down to the lower leg. And so they cross the hip joint and the knee joint.
Yeah.
So when it crosses 2 joints like that, you have this great opportunity to bend your knees, which will release the upper hamstring so that the
You
hamstrings no
actually
pulling down on the sit bones.
you
So you
get
can
more space in the hamstrings with the knee bend.
right, because even though we call it one muscle, we can think that it has 2 functions. So we're shortening the end of it by the knees. The hamstring gets busy doing that, and it stops tucking the pelvis. When you ask the hamstrings to lengthen at the knee, it's going to shorten at the pelvis, pulling you into the tuck, rounding the spine.
Got it. Yeah. So basically, it's a tight muscle and it's either going to like screw with the pelvis or the knees. So let's try to take the knees out of it a little bit.
When hip muscles are tight, they don't want to release. Instead, it's much easier for the low back to accommodate the tightness of the
Right.
hip.
It's going to give you space.
It's going to give you space, but not in a helpful way. And so this is why, as yoga teachers and as yoga students, we're trying to actually achieve that hip opening and preserve core stability,
Right.
low back stability.
Right. So I have a random fact about hamstrings. And if any of you guys are listening and this is complete bullshit, feel free to let me know. But it rang so true to me that I've hung on to this fact forever, is that the hamstrings got their name because it's kind of grisly meat. It's really tough meat, but they would hang pigs up by
Yeah.
those muscles. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Okay,
right.
cool.
That's why they're
So
called
yeah,
the
they'd string the hams.
Yeah, string them up by the hamstrings to be hamstrung. And we're all kind of hamstrung at first when we come to the yoga practice. That was my biggest sensation, probably, as a beginner in yoga. We should talk about why hamstrings want to be short.
Okay.
So your muscles don't want to just do whatever you ask them to do. Your nervous system instead decides that you spend most of your time with your muscles in a certain length and you don't really vary that a lot. So it's invested very strongly. They're very conservative. Nervous system is very conservative. Let's just keep those muscles the same length. And even though you can pull and yank on those hamstrings, you shouldn't. But when they don't yield, it's because your nervous system is invested. So you really have to find out, how do you set up the right conditions for the nervous system to say, you know what? I'm going to allow
I'm going to
this.
release, and that gets into the different ways that tissue releases, and that gets into the length of hold of poses, which in a vinyasa class, typically you're not holding the poses really long enough for the system to say, okay, we're cool, we can let go. I've decided I like to think of the body as like a rescue dog, right? So that if you just go up there and you're like, we're going to do this, the dog's like, no chance at all. So you got to be really nice. You got to stay there a while. You got to like tell them it's, you have to be really kind. It has to feel safe. You have to be there a while. It has to trust you're not going to hurt it. So you can't go too far, and then it will give. It's not going to give until the environment is hospitable.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that goes back to our sensation level, so that it should not be an extremely strong sensation in the
Yeah.
hamstrings. We want to go for moderate sensation in the belly of the muscles and away from the joints, away from the knee, away from the sit bone attachment.
Yeah. And one of my big things to look for is if you're tightening your jaw, it's too far.
The sensation is too strong.
And yeah.
And then it comes down to consistency, right? Which is also very useful
Yeah.
when you're training an animal, and you're
Yes,
basically
exactly.
training the animal of yourself, as we are animals. And so how do we set up a very consistent, predictable ask that's not just random? Like, I'm
Yeah.
not just going to yoga once a week or once a month or
Yeah.
once a year. That if there's a consistent demand, then the body will say, okay,
Okay. Oh, good.
I'll lengthen.
We'll move the edges
We'll
a little
move the
bit.
edges.
We'll move the boundary.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And that's why I love the yoga as a practice. I've always loved that understanding that it's a practice. So we show up, and that's the discipline. But if you say discipline to me, then I'm going to not want to do it. So I like to think practice because it's a little less.
Authoritarian.
Yes. It's a little less like it is.
I'm more willing to sign up for it as a contrarian person in general.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah,
but
you're never done. And that's what downward dog is, the pose that you're never done with.
yeah,
Never. Even if you find the rest, it's sort of like an elusive, like, ooh, okay,
Yeah.
I'm feeling that now. But I certainly feel as though my first downward dog is not the best one of the practice.
no,
No. Yeah. Maybe we should talk more about different options for leg positions to help align the legs for standing poses in general.
Okay.
We could just talk generally about the width
The
of the
stance.
stance.
Yeah.
And
Hip distance apart, don't you?
I would say the outer hip distance of the
Okay.
pelvis, especially the shorter the hamstrings are, the wider you want your feet.
Yeah.
At the beginning of class, take the feet as wide as the mat.
Well, and it's funny because that's why Pasarita Padottanasana, that wide-legged forward fold that we talked about before, is such a good way to start getting opening in the hamstrings.
Right.
Because the wider you are, the more access you have, because you're just creating
You're creating more space
distance.
for the pelvis to tilt forward.
Yeah.
And you can experiment with this in your poses and with your students and with yourself, is to widen the feet and narrow the feet. And the closer the feet come together, the more the pelvis favors that posterior tilt.
Yeah.
It's just a stronger ask. And then as the thighs abduct and get wider, it allows the pelvis to tilt forward, so that we can use this to help students warm up in class. The feet as wide as the mat, the thighs parallel, and then the knees centered over the feet. And then I even like something called a frog dog. It's like Baddha Konasana. So you kind of squat down like a frog. The heels come together and the knees widen. Like we can imagine a frog squatting, just to start to sit down in the pose. It allows people to get the chest to press down.
Got it.
Yeah, because you're just making so much space and room through the hips. You're stretching those very, very tight inner thigh muscles, which overall starts to open up the hips.
And it's so funny because when you said that, I'm going to try the frog dog next week, but you reminded me about the opening the chest. Like we've been talking about the hamstrings, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that ends up happening too is we want this elongated spine, but most of us, just because of the way we live our life, there's a little stickiness in the thoracic spine. There's a little bit of kyphosis just from our head being forward and our shoulders roll forward, but that's habituated into the way we move through the world and technology. And so the idea of getting some mobility in the thoracic spine and letting that come to neutral is really hard for a lot of people to access. So they would be able to learn that sensation in frog dog.
That's where we get to that weight distribution again. So when you see someone who has that excessive kyphosis, too much rounding in the upper back, they're probably putting 80% of the weight on their hands in
Yeah.
downward dog. And the frog dog helps them to sit back.
Yeah. It's so funny because you're talking about the posture of kyphosis and the shoulders rounded forward. And I can almost visualize someone who's trying to move into a handstand, because it brings so much of your weight forward.
Which
And
is often more comfortable for their body than it's so much sensation to sit into the legs.
yeah,
And I think
yeah,
people try to use their arms to do most of the poses because we're very hand and arm oriented. It's how we control the world is with our arms. And so we
yeah.
just figure we're going to do everything with our hands and our arms. And to start to pass the work of managing our body to our legs is a habit that needs to be cultivated.
Okay, so we've got the stance on the legs, and then the stance in the arms is similarly aligned. Let's start from tabletop pose because I think that's a pretty good place to start with your wrists underneath your shoulders and your knees underneath your hips.
I'd say your wrists
Slightly
in
forward,
front
slightly
of the
forward.
shoulders.
Yeah, I always end up putting mine slightly forward too. And then there's a cue that a lot of people use, which is the creases. Oh, that's my dog, Gracie.
Hi, Gracie.
The creases on the wrists are more or less parallel to the front of the mat. I like the thumb and the index finger to be the base of my palm on the ground, and I want the majority of my attention going into the ball mount of the fingers and the ball mount of the thumb while I'm trying to elevate the center of my palm away from the earth. So I'm trying to actually almost shorten in the palm. So there we are.
It's like a shallow disc of space there so that the middle of the palm isn't pushing down and the fingers aren't flaring up.
I got a couple little wrist push-ups I like. I like to actually be in tabletop and then hands slightly in front and then elevate the base of my palms off the ground like a 16th or an eighth of an inch. And then just go up and down and you'll feel the belly of the forearm get a lot of exercise. And that's really nice to strengthen because it doesn't get strengthened very often, especially when we're texting and typing and all that stuff.
Right, which we'll pause on that because here's where a lot of confusion is in the wrists is that even though we think of texting and typing and all of that as being finger flexion, it's often done in wrist extension. So people type with the back of the hand moving
Bent.
towards the shoulders in extension, in a little bit of a downward dog position. That's where that carpal tunnel comes from. The ergonomic devices try to elevate that wrist and restore that cupped position, which is why your ergonomics are so important if you do have a job that requires a lot of use of your hands. The strain in the wrist is from too much wrist extension. So we don't need to start pulling the fingers back. This is kind of a pet peeve of mine is a lot of teachers are doing more wrist extension to try to open this up more. But I feel like this is such a hyper irritated area that it's less helpful. So I actually like to stretch the hairy side of the arm into wrist flexion and more gently, and even without weight on it at first, because there can be so much tenderness.
That's so interesting. That's a really good point. I hadn't really thought about it because I was still doing the open up the wrist thing. I have these great bean bags that I got to put on your head for posture when you're sitting at the desk. It even has a little bow at the back. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. But I found that it's really helpful to put underneath my wrist when I'm typing.
I thought that's what it was for. I was like, oh, I like this one.
Yeah, it's really good. It's got multi-uses.
Well, that hand position gets us into the rotation of the arms, which is, again, a really strong demand for most people. So most of us, when we type, our shoulders are rounded forward, even people with really flat backs with a reversed kyphosis. Everyone's shoulders tend to be a little bit forward. Our chest muscles are very tight because we're using our arms in front of us, and the elbows tend to go out. So that means that the whole shoulder's internally rotated. So then when you try to do downward facing dog, our arms try to preserve that shape that they're using all the time. Again, the body's like, why would I change that? This is how you're being used.
Yeah.
When in fact, the upper arm has to externally rotate. The top of the arm has to rotate away from the head. And then the lower arm, rather, internally rotate, which is the opposite direction entirely. This is a huge ask.
And there's so many poses where the limbs are functioning that way, where one part is externally, the other part is internally. And
To
that takes
bring
a while to
balance.
figure out too. Right. And to protect the joints.
Right.
Yeah.
Counter spiraling is how the body naturally balances itself. And we cue that to try to bring the arm into its correct state when the arm is overhead, for instance.
Yeah. So the difficulty in externally rotating the upper arms is where a lot of people get super congested in the shoulders when they're doing down dog. Even just try to do that right now.
Yeah.
It closes in on you.
Shul-
Collarbones get short.
Yeah. The armpits face out. I think the armpits are a great way to understand how to start to position the arm for students because people opt for this internally rotated arm most of the time, which puts your armpit facing away from you.
Yeah.
And the shoulder has to come around, the armpit has to wrap towards the face. The armpit starts to turn inwards, forwards, closer to the midline of the body when we have all that external rotation. The elbow is also a helpful landmark. It shouldn't be pointing outwards. It's pointing more forwards towards the front of the body.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we get that in a simpler shape? Because training it in downward dog, once people lock out their arms just as fast as they lock out their knees.
You're just reminding me of Anna Forrest's turbo dog.
Right.
That's such a good pose.
I think it's a really helpful pose for advanced students to start to access some shoulder power,
Yeah.
especially women. We lack some of that native upper body strength. We need a lot of really solid, perfect mechanics in order to sustain any kind of longevity in this practice, especially if you want to do arm balances.
So tell me, how would you help people understand the arms for down dog?
So I'd start in a simpler shape on forearms and knees with a block between the hands.
Yeah.
And we'd start with external rotation. The inner arm is rolling out,
And the forearms up.
palms are facing up. So that if you make a little fist with each hand, your fingernails are turned towards the ceiling. The back of the hand is to the floor. And you give a little squeeze to the block.
Yeah.
Your thighs are set up so that they're perpendicular to the floor, knees underneath the hips. And flexible people will need to press their elbows down into the floor and isometrically
Pull back
towards the knees to
so they don't
recreate.
collapse.
Yeah, that's actually creating the natural braking system that isn't there for people who are very, very flexible in their shoulders, most teachers. And then for the kyphotic people, they usually don't have to do that as much. They do have to work on sinking the upper back down.
Yeah.
And then in that pose, you would shift forward. The stronger the shoulders are, you're able to shift your head over the block, maybe even
Right.
past the block, and then shift back halfway to child's pose. If you go all the way back, you've collapsed your shoulders.
Right.
So because the forearms are down, and if your elbows are pushing down and isometrically pulling back towards your knees, you should feel a natural braking system where you can't go as far back. That's allowing the scapula to upwardly rotate as it needs to. The shoulder blade needs to spin out to the side of the rib cage, like Anna Forrest was talking
Yeah.
about in that turbo dog.
Okay. That sounds good. It's always good to get the alignment without bearing weight. I think that bears weight, but just make the poses easier until you find the structure you're looking for and then build up from there.
Right. You could do the same thing lying on your back with
Yeah.
a block between your hands. Try not to drop the block on your face.
Yeah.
So the same setup exactly, except you're lying on your back and then keeping the ribs down.
I love that.
So you're the master of the core.
Yeah. And I love to start all these poses on the back because I do get on the back and then I have to try to find my core, right? I try to take my ribs and instead of them splaying out, which mine want to do, it's like I tried to knit them in. I'm trying to knit them in and bring them down. And then I'm trying to take the low belly and integrate that in and up and then keep the spine elongated, but not straight, not rounded. So there's a gentle curve in the low back. There's that same curve mirrored in the cervical spine. And then try to sustain that as I move my limbs. I have a coach I've been working with on breathing, and he's like, I don't want to see your ribs move. Your breath should be less disruptive and more subtle. And your ribs should be knitting in to support the system. You want them to be like a corset, right? Protecting and supporting the organs. Yeah.
I'm going to disagree with your breath coach, but everything's
Ooh.
context.
Right.
You know, in terms of how much do we want to shut down that rib cage movement?
Well, and we've talked about this before. I'm not talking about making it static, and I'm not talking about the core container being made out of aluminum, but I'm talking about the core container having some integrity to it. A lot of people who are predisposed to yoga have excess mobility. We've been talking a lot about the people who struggle with mobility, but a lot of people have too much mobility.
Probably anybody teaching it generally.
Yeah, generally anyone teaching it. And also because it feels really successful, it feels really good, right? So what happens to me is, first of all, I'll get people on the back and we'll bend the knees and we do cat-cow on the pelvis, right? We just rock back and forth on the pelvis and make it smaller and smaller so that we can find neutral, right? And neutral is not the absence of a curve in the lumbar spine. And I think that may no longer be taught. I don't really know, but it certainly was when we first started teaching.
It was popular in the 90s, this thought that you're only working your core if your lumbar spine is flat to the floor or the natural inward curve has reversed.
Right.
And
right.
that's not neutral. Right. It's not a neutral spine. It has its place as a technique, but it got mistaken for neutral. It got mistaken for a properly functioning core.
Yeah.
Right. Because the core includes your back muscles. And so we're not trying to have the abdominals overwhelm the low back muscles. We want both sides to be strong.
Right. That's such an interesting thing, how the back body really needs to be incorporated as we're strengthening the back of the core and the sides of the core.
So then if we take that back to downward facing dog, do we want to see a lumbar curve, a dipping inwards of the lumbar curve and downward facing dog or not?
No, you want a neutral pelvis.
But we're saying a neutral pelvis would be with a lumbar curve.
It's got a lumbar curve, but it doesn't have a dumpy lumbar curve. If I've got too much of a curve in my lumbar spine, my ribs will pop open. They work in relationship with each other. So I want my ribs integrated in. I want there to be a curve in my lumbar spine, but I don't want anything that's going to cause my ribs to pop.
It's really a matter of degree for each person to find individually. And then what happens when you change those spinal curves? What now happened in your armpits?
Yes.
In the shoulder joint? What happened to your pelvic tilt? What happened to your sensation in the pose?
I often see people who have a lot of mobility, they sink into the shoulder joint, they spread their ribs too far, their back gets a nice big arch.
So they're like dipping into that big back bend.
Yeah,
they need to lift up from the front, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think you're dealing with a younger, more flexible population than I am.
No, I deal with them both.
Okay. It's good to see both ends because they need different cues.
Right.
And that's where downward dog gets tricky as teachers. How do we set everybody up for success? If you're
Right.
teaching a group class, how do we get everyone accessing the alignment and then remind the flexible people when you're giving mobility cues, and you have to be cautioning the hyperflexible students, not you.
Yeah.
Zip up, use your abdominals, tone with your exhales.
Yeah.
Don't have sensation in your armpits when you do downward dog.
So we're talking about the core and the core being engaged in downward dog, not rigid, but just active and engaged, and how important that is for you to help shift your weight back off your hands, which is where we had started, which was the hand position. We've talked about the wrists, we've talked about the hands, but we're like, why are people having wrist pain? And I think a lot of the reason certainly is the arms. We talked about the arms, the external rotation in the upper arms, internal in the forearms. And that not being set up can cause a distribution of weight that puts undue pressure
on the pinky edge.
On the pinky edge of the hands.
Yeah.
And in my perfect world, there's like barely any weight on the pinky edge of the hand.
That's a high bar.
I know it is a high bar. It's aspirational.
It is aspirational.
The forearm is structured where if you've got the bulk of the weight on the pinky edge of the hand, it's the least supportive part of the arm. So it's not using your hardware in the most productive way. But if you come to the index finger and thumb, the primary base of the pose, that feels better to me. And it's also more powerful. You can press down into the ball mount of the fingers and then isometrically pull up into the armpits, try to get that pucker in the base of the palms, and then
lift in the armpit.
Okay.
I think we've covered it.
I want to make sure that when teachers are working with people and they say they have wrist pain,
Yeah.
a couple things to do is
Their
one,
shoulders are messed up, their core is messed up, and they're dumping the weight on the hands.
Yeah.
Just do the best you can, get their weight in their legs.
Yep.
Try to get them to stop springing their ribs forward. Tell them how to corset with an exhale.
Okay, good. So that's a nice little summary.
Yeah.
So we're done with the wrists.
We're done.
We're done with the wrists, right?
Right.
Okay, so this is
The
a good
abdominals.
question. So engaging the abdominals doesn't necessarily mean shortening them,
Agreed. That's true.
right?
Yeah, but when you ask a student to do it, they always think of a crunch. Everyone thinks of a sit up. Everyone, when they engage their core, thinks abdominals, and they think in the muscles shorten towards
Shorten,
the center
because the
muscles.
more I've been working with core, the less I do that. I do not want the pubic bone and the sternum to move towards each other.
So, how we have people use their core is really important. The more you engage your abdominals, the more you have a capacity to round the spine. So, that would take it out of the sagging,
Yeah.
but into more spinal flexion rounding for the tight student who
Ye-
actually needs to let their abdominals lengthen here and let go. Those tight people tend to grip, and their abdominals are way too shortened. Anyone in kyphosis, the abdominals are pulling the rib cage down into that rounding. The person who's sagging into a big back bend with the chest almost touching the floor, although they enjoy the sensation of the stretch in their armpits, which is the wrong place. They enjoy the sensation of stretch at their sit bones, which is the wrong place. And then the tight person, if we admonish people to use their core,
They're
if
just going to get shorter.
they're just going to get shorter and round more and
Yeah.
straighten their legs more and tuck their pelvis more. So it's really,
God, it's really amazing. We've been able to get people into down dog. After all this, it sounds like no one should be able to do down dog.
that's why doing the pose really early in the practice is interesting. If I do it early in the practice, it's brief
Yeah.
because the alignment is generally pretty bad.
Yeah.
Right. And so just getting people there to be like, ooh, this doesn't feel so great. Go do some other poses, come back. This is feeling better. You
Yeah.
go do some more poses. Okay, my hips are more open. Oh, downward dog doesn't feel so awful anymore. And
Yeah.
it doesn't look so awful. If you want to gauge success as a teacher using poses, or at least gauge how much your message is getting through in terms of alignment and how much awareness people are cultivating, which is part of yoga, see if their downward dogs get better.
Okay. Okay. So now that we're on this incredibly advanced pose, no, I'm kidding. But directionally, we're just trying to get to that 90-degree angle. It is an inversion, it's a forward fold, and it is the end point of a lot of standing sequences. It's a place to regroup.
Most people don't need to do crunches because that's only going to widen the rib cage at the base
Yeah.
more. So then finding the shapes where they can knit in through some twists, right? Some of those shapes can be more
Dead
beneficial.
bug's great.
Well, but if you're curling up,
You can't curl up.
aren't your head and neck off the floor?
No. No.
Keep your head and neck down
Yeah.
and shoulders down.
The way I understand it, you're on your back and it's reverse tabletop. So your arms are up and your thighs are perpendicular to the floor and your shins are parallel to the floor and your core is engaged. The goal is to have a neutral spine here.
Okay, well, anyone who can't get their back to the floor needs to try to get their low back to the floor to strengthen their core.
Uh-oh.
'Cause here
Here's
we
our
have-
first bar fight. But yeah, this is going to be an ongoing bar fight, the core.
Well, I mean, I think everyone's right. And this is what, especially as teachers and as students, we need to understand is every cue is totally valid for someone.
Right.
And probably if it's a cue that's been around for a long time, it's in response to a general trend of how bodies were appearing.
Right.
Right. And so then we were trying to say, okay, everyone's walking in hyperlordotic, too much arch in their low back. Their abdominals are too long.
Right.
And their hip flexors are too short and tight.
Right.
It's a very common pattern. It still exists. So then there was a trend for how do we reduce the lumbar curve? Well, we do that by strengthening the abdominals, and then tucking the tailbone became a shorthand way of doing that, which caused a lot of gluteal gripping. So it's fallen out of favor. But that population is huge. Shorten the abdominal length, lengthen the low back muscles.
Right.
And release the tight hip flexors, which pull the low back into an arch from the front. Okay, so we can call those people lumbar extension people. And then you have lumbar flexion people, which is a huge part of the population as well.
Right.
And so their abdominals are too short,
Right.
which, that can happen. And their lumbar spine muscles, paraspinals, are too long.
Right.
And their hamstrings are way too short. Their ribs often are in that sway back where the ribs pop forward. Their hip flexors might be short, but they're very, very weak.
Yeah.
And so
It's like the whole front body's short and the whole back body is longer.
well, not usually the whole, because the hamstrings are usually very short pulling down. It's just that lumbar spine is either going to tend to round too easily or not. So to keep it simple, you're going to have two broad types of people. And it might be different from when they're standing, but if you get them lying down on the floor, knees bent, feet flat on the floor, If when someone's knees are bent, their lumbar spine is flat to the floor, they do not need to work on pressing their low back to the floor. They do not need to shorten their abdominals. If you get down on the floor, the knees are bent, feet are on the floor, the low back is arched, those people, why? Their knees are bent, that means you've shortened the hip flexors, right? You've brought the legs closer to the trunk. That's what hip flexors do. If their low back is still arched, oh my goodness, that means their abdominals are very long,
Right.
and their hip flexors are very short and tight. And those are the people that love to hug their knees into their chest, which is a common relief pose that we give in yoga. So those people do need to work on pressing their back to the floor, because often they cannot. Anyone who cannot push their low back to the floor acts as a stop. It's not bringing them into excessive lumbar flexion. You could even, if you're concerned, you can put a small washcloth underneath the low back so you don't have them flattening all the way. But most often those people, their abdominals are so weak, they cannot flatten their back to the floor.
Okay. Okay. So going back to dead bug. So, and this will be interesting because usually what I do is I'll start with the knees bent, feet on the floor, right? And I'm trying to get to the position of reverse table, and I'm not flattening my low back to the floor, right? But what I try to do is just take one leg up to set up for reverse table, and I find that challenges my core already.
So my question then is, where should a student feel sensation?
I feel that in my lower belly. I feel it in my ribs. I feel it all in my core when I'm trying to keep the core stable and move a limb.
So then I think that that's exactly where you should feel it. So then if someone tries to keep that arch and then they lift the leg and their pelvis moves,
Right.
and if they don't feel it in their abdominals, and if they feel it in their back or their sacrum or their tailbone or the hip crease, they need more abdominals.
Right.
And so what we're trying to do is when we're trying to get people to use their core, they need to feel it in their core.
Right.
When they don't do it correctly, they're going to feel it in their
Somewhere
back.
else.
They're going to feel it in their low back. They're going to feel it in their hip crease, tailbone, or sacrum. And so that's when, if someone's feeling it more in their back, we need to look and feel. They can even use their own hands. I mean, people need to just touch their body so that cues so that cues make sense.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten to the pelvic floor, but we do need to touch our bodies. And we need to be friends with our body and be okay with it, whatever has happened.
Because people don't honestly know if muscles are working or not. We can feel it because we're professionals, and we can still argue about it. Like, people who are so divorced from their body,
Oh, yeah.
they need to touch it. Feel your abdominals. If you push down, you should go through the initial layer of fat, and then you should meet a wall of resistance. You should meet some tone there. And tone from your pubic bone all the way to your sternum, wrapping all the way around your waist. All of that should feel like there's a steady tone. Tap the microphone, tap, 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 tap. Put those fingers in and make sure there's tone. And then you touch the muscles of the low back. When you go to lift that leg, which is a fantastic exercise that you're suggesting, the low back should not grip.
Yeah.
And often you will not, the teacher has to feel it for you, or you have to feel it. You wouldn't even know it because it happens so habitually and unconsciously. It consumes us.
It consumes us.
We're so sensory. We're so in our body. People who teach yoga, we're like, doesn't it feel amazing?
Can you feel the left side of your pelvic floor?
Right. Can you feel your fourth rib?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. For most people. Right. And so helping people, because people were never taught that.
No.
It's not their fault. They were in fact taught, we were all taught as a culture, as a society, most of us were taught to ignore our bodies.
Yeah.
Ignore your emotions, stuff them down, don't give them wide play.
Yeah.
Which then helps to further shut down the body. I'm sorry, you're tired, keep going. You're hungry, too bad. That was our generation.
Yeah.
That's how we were raised, just tough it out.
Yeah.
And people absolutely bring that mindset to exercise, and they bring it to yoga. And we're asking them to do hard, complicated things, but not to tune out the body while they do it.
In relationship with it.
Right. Now what's your body saying? Oh, well, my thighs are working really hard. Well, that's an uncomfortable sensation, but that's a really safe one.
Yeah.
And that's a good one to feel.
Yeah. And take a few breaths.
Take a few breaths. Now we talk about the breath.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Breathing.
There'll be no arguments here.
Yeah, no, I'm afraid. Very afraid. Well, first of all, I know in down dog, you're supposed to breathe. So I'm very excited we can agree on that.
We can agree.
So one of the things about down dog is since it's an inversion, it typically will lend itself to a longer exhalation. And so thereby it activates the parasympathetic state of your nervous system, right? We have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is the calming one. It's the rest, digest, and it's soothing. So from that standpoint, if you allow yourself to extend your exhalation, you can get some relief, some sort of nervous system relief in that posture.
Right. And so I'm always interested whenever I hear that, I'm like, why? And how is that claim being made? And so I always come back to the physical anatomy of it. And so why would being upside down favor an exhale? And so we can think of when you exhale, the abdominals engage to push the diaphragm back up into the rib cage. So now when you're upside down, it's easier for the floor of your rib cage to go down towards the head, right?
Yeah.
Because you're upside down. So it assists the exhale, it assists the venous return, it assists,
Oh, yeah.
and that's supposedly the anatomical basis, although you could plunge into the chemistry of it, which I'm not qualified to
No,
do.
we're not going to do that. No. No. But yeah, it's just, yeah. If the inhale takes the respiratory diaphragm and it sort of expands it
Towards the pelvic
towards
floor.
the pelvic floor, and then the exhale, it comes back and kind of tucks back in under the ribs, it doesn't have to work as hard because it's just gravity helps it do that.
And this is why I think that in downward dog, you want to see some rib movement, because here's where the inhale's being challenged. And when the inhale's working properly, the lower rib cage should expand out to the sides. That means your diaphragm is moving. If your rib cage does not expand, it's not huge, it doesn't have to be a lot, but it shouldn't be zero. And so if we get some widening of the rib cage, especially when you're upside down, now I know, not that the ribs are flaring forward, not that we're swaying back where the bottom of the rib cage is dropping towards the floor. That can be up and in. I'm talking about sideways, left to right expansion and downward dog. Now, that's the hardest thing for the diaphragm to do, is to push towards the pelvic floor
Got it.
because it's upside down.
Yeah. So it's basically weight training.
Right. And so I think, like, when any breath coach or when anyone says this shouldn't be, we say, well, what's your application? Because, like, if you want to do a handstand in the middle of the room, allowing that breath to come in and have that diaphragm move is not going to be as helpful, because the diaphragm is also a big postural stabilizer. So go ahead and lock that shit down and walk on your hands across the
Right.
room, because I think if you start to get into high athletic performance, there's a time and a place and a reason for every cue.
Okay.
And that's why we don't want to get too married to any one particular thing. Like, well, I was told, the
Okay.
yoga posers said that this should never there's no such thing as never. There's
Okay.
always going to be a context. We're for even stopping the breath in downward dog, because you could train Uddiyana.
Uddiyana. Yeah.
Kriya.
People love to teach it there because, again, gravity helps you
Assist that
access.
exhale.
Yeah.
Yeah. And whether or not Uddiyana Kriya or Uddiyana Bandha, can those be taken to excess or overdone?
Of course, everything can be.
Everything can. So you have to look at what's happening to that lumbar spine, what's happening to the rib cage, what's happening in your internal sensation.
Right. Right. I'm still thinking about the ribs. I do like the rib movement.
It's your population and your goals. So
Yeah.
if your client easily,
And I like the broadening. I like the broadening of the ribs with the
they
breath.
too easily do that, if they have excessive lower rib
And
movement,
if anything's really easy for you, you don't need to
then
practice
you
it.
need to bring it to balance, because
Yeah.
yoga is that
That's it.
balance, right?
Yeah.
Anything in your body that's too excessive, too easy, sorry, we're
That's
going
not
to
what we
rein
need
it
to
in.
practice. That's
And
what we need
anything
to
that you have
practice.
no access to, that's shut down, shut out, we're going to wake that shit up,
Yeah.
and you're going to have a good cry about it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's when you know the class is good, is if it gets past the tissue and gets into the emotions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So shoulders we addressed, wrists we addressed, hamstrings, straightening the legs we addressed, and we addressed the fact that people get dizzy. And I guess the cue for there is come up more slowly.
Yeah, come up slowly, reduce the amount of time in inversions.
Yeah.
Keep your salt intake up if you have lower blood pressure generally. Just know that going up and down quickly will exacerbate any kind of dizziness.
Yeah.
I feel like I did train my capillaries. I swear over time I got much better, and the
See, this
dizziness
is what we were
diminished.
talking about. This is what we were talking about when we obsess. So Sarah's telling you that she trained her capillaries.
I did.
And you know what?
Because my allergist was like, stop doing inversions completely.
Oh, and you're like, screw it. No
So
way.
I stopped.
Oh,
And then I stopped doing downward dog. And then the
really?
next time I did downward dog, I was so profoundly dizzy. And I was going to say, I never had that level of dizziness before. And so I've gotten back to doing downward dog. And I feel like my nervous system has now learned to tolerate that. Whether or not it's like literally strengthening the capillaries, I don't have the anatomical basis for that. But
we're going to go with yes. We're going to go with yes.
A lot of what we're doing anyway is training your nervous system to endure the demand, right? So if you put someone under anesthesia, you can put their foot behind their head with, there's no issues, there's no restriction, because the nervous system is saying yes or no to these things. Now, it doesn't mean, well, therefore everyone should be able to put their foot behind their head, because no, there's no value in that, except if you're a contortionist, and those people have a lot of problems in their body. More range isn't necessarily better. We're trying to use the yoga practice to find your best range so you have less pain in your life.
Right.
And that might mean, like for me, my hamstrings need to be a little shorter than standard yoga teacher length. And I don't have issues with my sacrum. I don't have issues with my low back. They're the just right length for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is such a good way to wrap it all up, because really that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to wake up the places that we have ignored. And we're trying to bring them into the equation so that the whole system can be of service. The places that are overused or habituated or too open, we want to bring some integrity to them, again, so that this system can work with us. So we serve it so it can serve us.
Without like copping out, without overdoing. It's the just right temperature of the porridge.
Yeah, just right. So this has been so fun.
Yeah.
And thank you guys for joining us. And
send in your questions.
Definitely send in your questions, because you can tell from the conversation we had that there's more questions than answers.
We didn't even get into a one-legged downward dog.
Oh my God, there's so much we didn't get into.
What about therapeutic applications? I don't really think downward dog is therapeutic. I think it's a benchmark, but I don't know that in and of itself, it's not my go-to yoga therapy pose ever.
If I have a 90-degree angle pose that I go to therapeutically, it's legs up the wall.
Right. Or Dandasana if it's active, right?
Yeah.
And legs up the wall for, right?
Like calming down your nervous system when you think you're going to have a panic attack.
Right. I'm not going to say go into downward dog and try to calm yourself.
No.
It's an active pose.
Yeah. I actually have never used it therapeutically.
So therapeutic applications, although anything can be argued, and it
Yes, I'm sure it
depends
is.
on the context, because if you take someone who just did some monumental effort, maybe for them, like I used to go to boxing classes, and at the end they were like, go into downward dog. And I'm like, I will vomit and die. I have no idea why someone thought like suddenly going into downward dog after a hugely vigorous cardiovascular exercise would be good. But maybe for some of those students, it actually is. Maybe they're like, you know what? This is something totally different.
I feel like I got to check with the cardiologist on that one.
Yeah. It didn't work for me.
Well,
And that's where you start to discern as the student, right?
Yeah.
You just start to say, you know what? Maybe valid for you, not so much for me today. And maybe tomorrow, you know what?
it's perfect.
It's great. Open mind, discerning mind.
Right. That's what we're going for. So thank you for listening to Yoga Posers, and we'll see you next week.
Bye, Jane.
Bye, Sarah.